Nobody could get this sad-looking Labrador away from the grave. The family was confused as their late grandmother never even had a dog. Eventually, the police were called to deal with the situation, and on a hunch, they decided to open up the grave to see what this dog was reacting to. What they found, it shocked them to the core. It made so much sense now why this animal refused to leave the grave. The police finally arrived. The storm had picked up, and the situation had become very dangerous. If they couldn't get this dog away from the grave, it would probably die tonight. Gab explained to the police she had heard strange noises from the grave and wanted to investigate, but the dog kept getting aggressive toward her if she came closer, so the police did what they had to do. The only option was to try and gently pry the dog away, and if it didn't obey, they had to tranquilize it. They had to act very fast because of the storm, and when they were finally able to dig the grave up, they found something they never expected to find. But what was the dog doing at the grave? And what was inside of it? Gabby was heartbroken when she lost her grandmother. She had always been very close to her, and her loss left a massive hole in her life. Despite her grief, Gabby made it a point to visit her grandmother's grave almost every week. She would bring flowers and sit with her for a while, talking to her and sharing stories about her life. She made it into a routine. Every Friday around noon, she would sit with her grandmother for about an hour. All her friends and family knew they wouldn't be able to get a hold of Gabby around that time because she would leave her phone at home. But that wasn't always the smartest thing to do. For Gabby, it was necessary to have her full attention on her grandmother. But for others, it could be inconvenient. They wouldn't be able to contact Gabby if something happened and vice versa. But Gabby never cared about that until today. Because today, something happened that made her wish she had her phone with her. Today, as Gabby walked up to her grandmother's grave, she noticed something very strange. A dog was lying on top of a grave next to her grandmother's, and it seemed to be very comfortable there. Gabby was a little puzzled but didn't think much of it. Not at first. She sat down at her grandmother's grave and began talking as usual. She stayed for an hour, just like any day, and then decided it was time to go home. But as she got up, the dog began to growl at her. It even showed its teeth. She slowly sat down again, and the growling stopped. Gabby feared the dog was aggressive and wished she had her phone with her to call for help, but she didn't. She knew there was only one thing she could do: get up and run away. Her heart was pounding as she waited for the right to do it, and when it finally came, she ran for her life. The dog didn't follow her, which she found a bit strange, but Gabby was just glad nothing happened. She was a little shaken up from the encounter, so when she returned to visit the cemetery the next week, she brought her phone. She hoped the dog would be gone by then, but sadly for her, it wasn't. As she entered the cemetery, Gabby noticed the dog in the exact same place. He was still curled in a ball on top of a stranger's grave. She wondered if the family of the deceased person owned the dog. She walked around the dog in a big swerve and sat down at her grandmother's grave. There was a big storm on its way to where Gabby lived, so she knew she had to make her visit quick this time. They reported a lot of rainfall, and since the cemetery is next to a river, it could overflow. She was done with her visit and on her way out of the graveyard when something stopped her, saving him before the storm. The sight of the dog, still curled up on a grave, made her stop in her tracks. What if that dog wouldn't leave in time for the storm? It could end very badly. He could get hypothermia, for instance. And even though the dog hadn't been very nice to her, she couldn't bear to leave them alone. So, she decided to try and pry the dog away from the grave. She rushed to the store and bought some dog treats. When she got back, the dog was still in the same spot, but it had started to drip. Little droplets of rain fell down from the sky. He's eating the bait. She laid the treats in front of the dog so that he could eat something. Gabby figured he must have been starving. After he ate a few treats, the dog's tail started to wag a little. This gave Gabby a confidence boost to keep going. She laid a little trail of treats in her direction and waited for the dog to move. "Why won't you move?" But the dog didn't move at all. Instead, he looked at Gabby with its big brown eyes as if he wanted the treats but couldn't get up. Was he hurt? Gabby slowly got closer to see if he had an injury, but the dog started growling again. Gabby felt torn. She didn't want to leave the dog, but he wouldn't let her help him. She laid a few more treats near his nose so he could eat, but then she heard something. It sounded like something she had never heard before, and she had no idea where it came from. But then she listened closer. Gabby turned her ear toward the grave and leaned in a bit. She closed her eyes to focus on the sound and finally realized where it came from. It came from the dog, or under the dog, maybe. She knew it came from that direction, so she decided to investigate. The droplets of rain became bigger and bigger. Gabby knew she had to hurry up, so she quickly walked around the grave. At first, she saw nothing out of the ordinary, but then she heard that sound again. So she walked around the grave one more time and finally noticed something, finally locating the sound. Gabby got down on her hands and knees and put her ear to the ground. She listened again and shot up as she realized the sound had come from the grave itself. How is that possible? All kinds of different scenarios raced through her mind, but one thing was certain: can't do it on her own. Gabby knew she couldn't do this on her own. The wind started to pick up and she was in a serious time crunch. Luckily, she had her phone with her this time so she could call for help. Unfortunately, she didn't know who to call, so she dialed the only number she thought would be able to help her. Dialing 911, the police. Gabby dialed 911 and talked to the operator. She explained her situation and asked for the police to come, but the operator had some bad news for her. Because of the storm, the police were very busy, and they wouldn't be able to get to her fast enough. Waiting for the police, Gabby told the operator to send them anyway and that she would wait. She was determined to save the dog and uncover what was going on with the grave. The rain intensified, and Gabby noticed the dog shivering from the cold. She quickly ran to her car, searching for a blanket, but it wasn't there. She had left it at home. Returning to the grave, now drenched from the downpour, she was relieved to hear the sound of approaching police sirens. Waiting near the cemetery entrance, Gabby waved her arms as the flashing blue and red lights came into view. Two officers stepped out of the vehicle, and Gabby hurriedly explained her concerns. Initially skeptical, the officers seemed puzzled by her distress over a dog refusing to leave a grave, but they agreed to investigate. When they reached the grave, one officer attempted to coax the dog away, but it wouldn't budge, just as Gabby had described. Then Gabby mentioned the strange sound coming from the grave. The officers' expressions shifted as their curiosity was piqued. They began asking Gabby questions and speculating about the source of the noise, but none of their theories seemed to fit. As the rain poured and the ground turned to mud, Gabby heard the sound again and alerted one of the officers. They crouched, pressing their ears to the wet ground. This time, the officer heard it too. After a moment of consideration, he made a startling suggestion. "Let's open the grave." Gabby was stunned. The idea of digging up a grave felt outrageous and possibly illegal, but deep down, she knew it might be their only option. She glanced at the silent second officer, who sighed and reluctantly nodded. "I'll get the shovels," he said. Gabby's heart raced as the second officer returned with tools. Although overwhelmed by the situation, she was relieved that they didn't expect her to join the digging. Instead, she stayed by the dog, keeping it calm as the officers began their grim task. Standing in the rain, watching the muddy excavation unfold, Gabby couldn't believe what was happening. Yet, the strange sound and the dog's unwavering presence convinced her that something beneath the grave deserved to be uncovered. The officers tried to lift the gravestone, but quickly realized it was too heavy with the dog still on it. As they tugged at the stone, one officer noticed something unusual and began digging next to the grave. Gabby watched anxiously as they worked, the wet ground complicating their efforts. The officers' strained expressions hinted they knew more than they were letting on, leaving Gabby feeling helpless. The dog, sensing the activity, began whining, its heartbeat racing under Gabby's hand. Suddenly, its tail wagged, and to Gabby's amazement, the dog got up, approached the officers, and started digging alongside them. As the officers dug, the hole repeatedly filled with water, forcing Gabby to run to her car to fetch a water bottle to help scoop it out. Finally, as the water receded, the officers decided to dig horizontally toward the grave. Their careful, deliberate approach puzzled Gabby, who realized they had planned this all along but didn't share the details with her. As they neared the gravestone, they switched to digging by hand to avoid damaging anything. At last, a deep hole was revealed beneath the gravestone. One officer reached his arm into the hole and, after a moment of searching, his eyes widened as he found something. Pulling his arm out, he revealed a tiny, soaking wet puppy. Gabby gasped and quickly took the puppy from him, cradling it in her arms as the mother dog barked and wagged her tail with joy. But it wasn't over. The officer, hearing more noises, reached back into the hole and retrieved 5 more puppies. The mother dog, now identified as female, was reunited with her litter of 6. All were cold and shivering from the storm. Gabby decided to take the mother and puppies home to care for them. She thanked the officers, loaded the dogs into her car, and drove home. After bathing them and making warm, comfortable beds, she took them to the vet the next day. There, the mother was scanned for a chip, and Gabby was relieved to find she had owners who could be contacted. The dog's owners were overjoyed to hear about the rescue. They explained the mother had run away to give birth and was unable to return during the storm. They had searched but lost hope after days of bad weather. Grateful for Gabby's care, they offered her one of the puppies as a thank you gift. Gabby, thrilled by the opportunity, accepted the puppy and brought it home. The mother and remaining puppies returned to their owners, where they were cared for until the puppies were adopted. Gabby, now with a new furry companion, felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing she had played a part in reuniting a family and saving lives.